If you ever get into an argument or disagreement with someone who's quite quick to temperament and is very likely to rear up against you, a defensive tactic they may use, which you are quite commonly you would come across quite often, is demonization, which in basic forms is when the person takes their wrong spin. So in the wider scheme, they were sort of the wrong side of the argument, but they take their wrong side and peddle it against your correct side by making you look bad and making you look immoral in your argument. Say on a smaller scale, if you bumped into someone and their phone fell out of their hand, and then they go and tell their friends, who are also your mutual friends, that you purposefully try to break their phone. That would be an example of demonization. On a wider scale, say how capitalism began to show some quite heavy faults in the 70s, and people thought maybe communism and socialism wasn't that as problematic than the US with all the McCarthyism, and everything kicked off and said, no, communism is the worst thing possible. It's unsustainable, it's killer, it's worse, despite the fact that the American government is equally responsible for 10 times the amount of death under communist regimes, and there are still communist countries like Cuba running successfully. So it basically is making the other person out not just to be the wrong party, but to be the bad party, to be the enemy, to be not just your enemy, but the enemy of morality, the enemy of sort of righteousness. You push them down into the depths of the bad and into evil so that you rise up atop. And this is at the very basis of things like progressive fascism, or things like patriotism, even nationalism especially. You just sort of take your wrong opinions you have, and because the other person is right, you can't appropriately argue against the correct situation, so you try your best to make that person out as incredible, not incredible as in uncredible, and wrong, not just in their argument but in their being and as a person. Because when you can't attack the claim, you tend to attack the person. That's demonization, as I said. And I've been at the brunt of it in small time and sort of big time arguments, and I've seen it, and I've know that it happens, and it's really difficult to combat, because the person distances themselves so much from the subject matter of the actual debate, that as soon as someone mentions a demonization of character, especially if it's within sort of a public climate, no one is going to just revert right back to the actual matter of debate to sort that out, and everyone will just focus on sort of the shambolic symbol they've put upon the debatee. You will not want to argue with someone of a degree, because they themselves have figured out that they are unable to argue their point, so they make the situation unable to be argued by turning you, their opponent, into someone not worthy of disagreement, because you're evil, you're immoral, what you've done is entirely of malice, you want bad things to happen, and that's what they make people think, so that people actually take the bad things as good things. It's demonization of the good to justify the wrong, basically. It happens, as I said, in small time things, but also huge scale things. Think of the American government now, we're definitely guilty of plenty of forms on both sides. Both parties have things that they demonize, which in retrospect are actually really good. Trump demonizes Medicare, which I'm sure there are thousands of people who would praise endlessly. And yes, of course, there is huge gun debate laws, but people out there will say guns are terrible, and they demonize guns, and then there are other people out there who would say, well, for me, there was a scenario where a gun saved my life. So you get these both sides where you can't you can never have the angel and the devil. You can never have the good and the bad. We don't live in an objective world. That's just not a physically possible thing. We live in a deontological world where it really is sort of situation dependent. You need to evaluate and assess and just make sure that you're arguing the case and not the person, because when you begin arguing the person, it just becomes invalid, because a demonizing person will not care for your argument. They will be stuck in their ways and accept themselves as right regardless. That's just that. Yeah, this is just mainly a video on making you aware of staying away from demonization, and also major shade thrown at like Trump bootlickers, because they're so stubbornly in their ways. He will say something so incredibly wrong and they will come out and agree with it, then 2 weeks later will say something equally as incredibly wrong but entirely contrary to the thing he said 2 weeks before, and they're like, yeah, that's true, when in retrospect you can't say both are true because they cancel each other out, but they justify it with demonization, which doesn't work and makes you out to be a terrible debatee.